Whatever time you're tuning in the program called What's Going On FlintTalkRadio.com. I'm George Moss, the host of the program, and I'm having a little bit of problems, a few problems here listening to myself and not getting the feedback, but we'll go on with the show anyway. Want to thank you for tuning in. It's about 2:05 here in the studio, and outside the studio is raining cats and dogs, which, which by the way brings up, I can't figure out why cats and dogs can't get along. They have a lot in common. You know, if it's true that, what is that saying they have, that a rising tide lifts all boats? And if that's true, it's a lot of sailing going on out there outside the studio. It's really raining hard around here. But as you know by now, if I'm not out of the country, this show will go on, and we will put it on regardless as to the weather conditions, unless there's so much snow out there that we haven't been able to get the street shovel that allow us to arrive here at the studio. But other than that, we will in fact be here, and hope you'll be here as well. We have a lot of things to talk about, and you're not going to believe what we're going to start off with today. And John, you're not going to believe this either, because I'm going to be starting off talking about the Lone Ranger. John, have you seen this film? If you haven't seen it, don't waste your time. I'm going to talk about that on the program today for about 10 minutes or so. But if you've not seen the Lone Ranger, and I don't know if you were a cowboy fan or not, but you know that was the going rate in our neighborhood. If you weren't watching the cowboy movies and didn't see all of the cowboy pictures that came on television, you were not really down with the cause. And then playing in a neighborhood where if you didn't have a cap pistol, you took one of the coat hangers and you bended it back, and then the pod that you had for hanging the coat hanger up on the closet, whatever you call that thing, the shelf of the closet, then you would bend the rack back, and you'd have that clothes hanging pod as the trigger, and you made your own gun, put it in your side, pulled it out, and you never did get shot. You always get wounded, but the guy said, "I got you," but you never died. You always got wounded, and you would grab your arm and all that. So we in our generation, we were cowboy fans, and we watched all the cowboy programs, and one of them was the one that Hollywood is messing with in the Lone Ranger film. You've done it now, Hollywood. I thought you had reached your apex with Abraham Lincoln and the job you did on that film, which was nothing but nonsense.
All about him being a vampire slayer?
No, the one where the Civil War is being fought, and the film covered the last 4 months of the war from January to April of 1865. It didn't even cover the earlier part, which was showing some of the contradictions.
I had a guy ask me online. He's from India, and he said, I read somewhere that before Abraham Lincoln was president, he was a vampire killer. And I went, oh my God.
Yeah, and they would believe anything if they've been to the public school. Let me see if I can turn this up for a minute here. So forgive me.
It should be number one. Yeah, it should be number
one.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see here. I should turn it toward me, right?
No, towards the window.
You?
Towards me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see now. Oops, that's not going to work. Okay, we'll try this. So we have to have perfect sound here at the studio, and
can you hear yourself now?
I'm a little bit better.
Yeah.
Okay. And we don't have perfect sound. We feel like we are calling you out on those of you who watch us on Facebook and on the other networks, and et cetera, et cetera. We have to have perfect sound at Flint's #1 podcast studio in the city of Flint and Genesee County. And as we always say here, we're working hard to become the #1 podcast program in the whole universe. And that's going past a lot of the alphabet soups out there, such as these networks that I can barely listen to, and I'm going to talk about that later on as well. But let's start out talking about a movie I saw yesterday. I went to see The Lone Ranger. And what I was looking for in looking at The Lone Ranger was what I had experienced in my childhood, where the cowboys were never ambivalent. You can always tell the good guys by the kind of horses they rode. And they never rode horses that you couldn't identify who the good guys were and the bad guys were. That was this guy named Big Dave, and he was a little on the obese side, so he was definitely well named in the movies, in the cowboy pictures. And he always wore, the kind of hats that let you know this is not a good guy, and then his weight was kind of like a problem. And so we kind of identified him as he's obese, so he can't be too good. This is before they even started telling us that we'd eat spinach, although Popeye was, telling us that. But I watched The Lone Ranger. It was like a religion on Thursday at 6:30. The Lone Ranger came on after we had dismissed the news. We didn't want to hear nothing about the news. And most Americans at that time didn't want to pay attention to the news. You could not have had, I don't think, in that time period, a news program that lasted 30 minutes or all day, as it happens right now on some of the cable networks where people watch the news all the time, as I do. But at that time, 15 minutes of news, you would get out of here. We want to watch these cowboy pictures, and we didn't tune it in. The news came on at 6 o'clock to 6:15. That's local, and then 15 minutes of national, and then out of there with the news, and then bring on our programs. And one of them was on Thursday called The Lone Ranger. And that was starring Clayton Moore. See, you don't have to help me with these TV programs in terms of who starred in the cowboy pictures. I can tell you every one of the stars. And they had Jay Silverhills playing Tonto. He was a Native American, so they had a Native American playing the role. And they talk about, back in that time period, they talked about how Tonto, the Native American, was always the one that was being rescued by Lone Ranger, and Tonto was always in trouble. The Native American was always needing some help from the Lone Ranger, and they want to make it appear that was about some racism in the making of the movie. But if you look at, if that would be the case, then what do y'all think about Chester's leg in Gunsmoke? They tried him out, and both of them were James Arnaz and Dennis Weaver, who played Chester. We're gonna be straight guys, but two straight guys. When I say straight, let me make that clear, because straight then was something different than straight today. When I say straight back in that time period, I'm talking about straight in terms of one being the strong character and one being the weaker character. And so when they had Tonto playing the weaker character, and they want to make it racism and all of that, now they're looking back at it. What about James Arnaz playing the role, and then Chester? First of all, Chester didn't have a splint in his leg where his leg was broken. He couldn't bend his leg. It was both of them, but that doesn't work when you have two strong characters. Which one are you supposed to identify with? So in the filming of the program, Chester came back the next day, because it didn't work the first day when they had the filming. So he came back the next day when they get ready to film for the program with this accent. Mr. Dillon, and then he came back with his leg being stiff, and that worked, because now we can identify James Arnaz as the star, and Chester is a sidekick, and that was par for the course. The sidekick was always needing rescue from the guy who was playing the strong person.
Do you know James Arnaz was 6'8", 6'8"?
Yes.
He's huge. He was huge. They say he was one of the tallest people in Hollywood.
Yes, he was. Yeah. And did you know, John, that they offered that role to John Wayne, and John Wayne didn't think it was going to go anywhere? Who could have predicted that role was going to be played for 20 years by James Arnaz?
Well, don't forget, it was on radio.
They turned it down.
William Conrad, who played Cannon.
They offered him, the Wild Wild West.
No, the guy played Conrad, William Conrad.
Oh, William.
The guy who played the heavier set guy used to play.
Oh, yes.
He played Matt Dillon on the radio for 20 years.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, when you get into those westerns now, you're talking to the person that watched all of them, and I didn't find any problem with Tonto playing the lesser of the roles, because that was par for the course. Look at Buster Crabbe and Fuzzy. Or look at the King of the Cowboys, and that's not you, Gene Autry. You can just get on out of here with that. The King of the Cowboys was Roy Rogers. And look at Gabby Hayes, who was his sidekick, who was, a lovable character, but was, never the strong person that Roy Rogers was. He come up there and club you with his fist, and you're out of here. And didn't have to use his guns. But that was the way it was. But I'm getting back to this film that I saw yesterday with the Lone Ranger, because I'm going back to reclaim some of my childhood. Back in the time we were innocent, where we could tell who were the good guys and who were the ones following outlaws who were not following the laws and had to be corrected by the good guys who always won, and there was never any ambivalence about it. But John, I went to the theater yesterday, and I sat there for that film lasted. It started at 12:10. The first one was sold out. I went out there to the one in Grand Blanc because the one is gonna start later on Graham Road. So I wanted to see it as early as I could, and they had a showing at 10 something in the morning. I went there, and that one was sold out, but they had it in a smaller theater. And so I went and bought a ticket for the one that started at 12:10. And I asked the guy, I said, "You mean to tell me this film is so popular that it's selling out? How many seats do you have left in the one that's going to be showing at 12:10?" He told me that the one at 12:10 was not sold out. And the one reason one was sold out at 10:15 was because it was showing in the smaller theater. So it wasn't like everybody's just like a groundswell of people going in there. And I was surprised to see when I went in there to the one that showed at 12:10. I was surprised there were any young people in there because they can't remember the Lone Ranger. I thought a lot of adults would be in there for the reason that I was in there, and that was to watch the Lone Ranger, giving our nostalgic look back into the past when we were living in a much more simple time period, and a time period was much more innocent than right now, where everything is about ambivalence, where you can't tell what's right, what's wrong. Nobody wants to make a decision about that. And the personalities on the screen, they are ambivalent. So I went there looking for, Clayton Moore and Jay Silverhill. And Jay Silverhill was always, clean shaven, no paint on his face. And here's this guy. I should have known something was up when I walked in the theater, John. Here was Johnny Depp playing Tonto. And there was this guy. I don't know how the Native Americans felt about this. But the guy was all in all kinds of paint. The paint was cracking on his face. I mean, that was so much paint in this guy's face. I couldn't even tell it was bad. It looked like he was wearing a mask. His mask made out of paint. And one guy said, before I got to the theater, I read where one guy said that the film should have been called Tonto. And if I didn't know what he meant by that before I went to the theater, I can tell you that I know what he means by it now, because although the paint on Tonto's face, I thought discredited, Native Americans. They would put, lines on the face to identify them as part of what particular ethnic group they would belong to, which you call tribe, which I think that's a word we can use for all groups. Everybody belonged to some tribe. But it was identified what group, and all that paint on their face and all that. Well, I couldn't tell it was in the skin under there. There was so much paint. But that film should have been called Tonto, because the way they did it in political correctness, although they had a lot of paint on his face, and I don't know how the Native Americans feel about it, they threw the Native Americans a bone. And Johnny Depp, I found out after they came out of the theater and did some research on it, actually said that they wanted to make sure they didn't offend the Native Americans. And the way they did that was reverse the roles that had been played back in the time of the Lone Ranger. Guess who the star was? Tonto. And they had the Lone Ranger. I don't even know this guy's name. I didn't want to know his name. You messed up the Lone Ranger, so get out of here. But that's the way I feel about it. you mess with my Cowboys, and I was raised on cowboy movies. We weren't hear nothing about Casablanca, and what's that guy's name that starred in Casablanca, John?
Borgnine, Ernest Borgnine.
Humphrey Bogart.
Humphrey Bogart, Ernest Borgnine. What did I say Ernest Borgnine for now?
Yeah,
Humphrey
I didn't
Bogart.
want to hear. We didn't want to see none of that. Anybody in there with no horses on their hips and guns? If you're not swinging through a tree like Tarzan, and you don't have a gun on your hip and walk around riding on a horse and walk around in the saloon and getting you a drink and daring anybody to say anything, we don't want to see that. And we didn't want to see. And we did not want to see the cowboy having a girlfriend. I mean, yuck! We didn't like girls at that point, and we were scared of girls. So the idea. The one time I saw a cowboy, he put his hand up there on the screen. I mean, he kissed his horse. We didn't have no problem with that, because we like the horse, Trigger and all of that, Silver. And Buttermilk, that was Dale Evans's horse. Trigger was Roy Rogers' horse. Champion was a horse by Gene Autry, the one that couldn't act and couldn't sing, and thought he was king of the Cowboys. When I understand that one of them went into the service, and they said he was the king of the Cowboys when one of them went into the service to serve the country. But that wasn't true. There's always Roy Rogers. There always will be Roy Rogers. But Lone Ranger was Thursday night, and that's all there is to that. So I'm going there looking for my heroes, only to find out, and I will never forgive Hollywood for this, and I don't know if I go to another film I had to, get the bad taste out of my mouth, and I don't know if I can go to another movie for a while because I'm been out of shape over how they treated the Lone Ranger, and that was Tonto was a strong, heavy in the film, and they had the Lone Ranger as a bumbling, stumbling idiot. I couldn't believe it. Weak, milquetoast, indecisive. I couldn't believe that. And they were telling us that the name Kemosabe, which we always wondered, what is Tonto talking about? We don't speak what language is that? I didn't get that in my Spanish class, and I heard all kinds of things what it meant. Now I found out that they told me in the film yesterday it means wrong brother. So now I got to deal with this issue. The one that was killed in the Rangers, and there were 7 of them, not 6. I counted them on the screen. And out of the 6 out of the 7 that rode, 6 of them were killed, and one of them was the Lone Ranger's brother. And so now Tonto, who wasn't there, by the way, when the Lone Ranger became the Lone Ranger, because they didn't have him coming up there when he was laying there halfway dead and all of that. They getting ready to bury the Lone Ranger. The guy thought he was dead. So, and there we see his face. That's another thing that turned me off. We saw the guy's face. The Lone Ranger never showed his face. Even when they made him take his mask off because he's no longer Warner Brothers Lone Ranger. They wanted to sell it to somebody else, make a movie out of it. Didn't want to include him. They said he was too old. So they wanted to have another Lone Ranger come up there, and he came up there and messed it up. And now the Lone Ranger got to wear goggles, his shades on in public. Couldn't wear the mask anymore. But he never showed his face. And I must say this, I did see it in one of the other films he starred in before he played the role of the Lone Ranger, so I did see how he looked. But after he played the Lone Ranger, you never saw his face. And they didn't show me his face on the screen. That made me mad. And I tell you this, even before, John, I was fuming over that. Let me tell you the first thing that made me mad in the movie. I don't know if you've been to those theaters out there in Grand Blanc. And I don't know if this is all of them, but the one I was in, there's only one side you could go down to get out of the theater. You had to go down to the left side. There's no exit on the right side. So let me tell you what I think that's about. You know how they say you can get as much popcorn as you want if you buy the biggest size and get as much pop? Well, how many of you out there in the Flint Talk Radio listenership, and I know all of you are very modest people out here in our listenership because we're very modest in the air, and that is, how many of you would like to walk in front of the whole audience going across the screen on the way back and see you going back to get some more popcorn, which you agree to self, and some more pop, and every time you go down that lane, you got to go down the right side, come across the screen, go outside in front of all these folks, guard everybody else, come back in the theater, walk back across the screen, up the side where there's no way to exit, and then come across again in front of all the people. Well, I made 2 exits. I had to go get some 3 exits because I had to go get some pop to wash all that salt down. But I was embarrassed because I think what the managers are doing is telling you can have all the popcorn you want, get as many refills as you want, and then embarrass you by going to get it. So you simply sit there because you don't want to get embarrassed. But I like popcorn, so I went back twice for popcorn, once for the pop, and I had the biggest size of all of the all of my sides. But I'm sitting there fuming because I'm thinking they're trying to embarrass me, and then the movie hadn't even started. And I'm already on my second box of popcorn, so I'm already fuming before the show started. But I sat there the whole 2 hours plus because it wasn't over until around 2 something. I think about 2:15. I could be wrong on that, but I know it lasted more than 2 hours. And I'll be honest with you out there in the listenership. If you're going to see that movie, don't say that Moss didn't warn you, because if you saw The Lone Ranger as a child, you're not going to be a happy camper. That film just assaulted the Lone Ranger, made him a nerd. I mean, this guy didn't know anything. And if they make any money on that movie, and I read some of the write-ups about it, I'm going to write my write-up about it and give my critique, but I was really offended by it. And I kept saying, this is a mockery. And just as I was walking out of the theater, I said that to a person that was sitting over to the side. They were in the back, and they were going through withdrawal as I was. Because by the time that movie was over, I was down there under the seat. I was I was having so much withdrawal agony. I was having so much anxiety going on that I was actually under my seat by the time that film came to a close. And on my way out, I told this one guy, I didn't even know him, I said, that was a mockery. And it really was a mockery. But if you were a Cowboy fan, those of you that went there because you were going for nostalgic reasons, I can tell you right now, you're not going to be a happy camper when you see that film. And I know I was disappointed, and I wanted my money back. But I guess I ate so much popcorn, I didn't feel comfortable asking for any money back, all the popcorn I eat.
But now see, the Lone Ranger was a Texas Ranger that survived a massacre, wasn't it?
Yes, he was.
And see, nowadays they're trying to recast them as horrible men. They did some stuff we'd question nowadays, but they were the law on that for the frontier there. I mean, they were. There was one. They used to say one riot, one ranger. They used to send one man to clean up a town, and they were tough guys. I mean, they didn't believe in Miranda warnings and stuff. So you can't judge them by what our standards of law enforcement now. But they were gutsy individuals, man. They had no backup.
I mean, John, you take Wild Bill Hickok. If you read his bio, you know that he was called Wild Bill for a reason. Anybody go in that town, he had his guns backwards. And I mean, I'm talking about the real Wild Bill Hickok. Anybody went in that town and you said anything to him, he got that badge on, you either close your mouth in his presence or you got shot. That's why, my brother's a police officer. They call him Wild Bill because he was that kind of police officer down in Birmingham. Hope he's not watching this. But we were, Cowboy fans. And those of us who were raised with those images, and we were being instructed by the Cowboys. I mean, they use Hopalong Cassidy to teach us to not lose our gloves. He come on the set and do some community service and tell us, kiddies, don't forget now to make sure when you leave school, you have your gloves. And we want to disappoint Hopalong Cassidy. So when we left school, we checked our pockets. Want to make sure our gloves are in our pockets. Because that's just the influence they had with us. And to their credit, they always made it clear that at the end of that program, the bad guys were going to lose. I think that's a lot of why we were morally grounded as way we were. Our heroes were instructing us about how we ought to behave. And some of it wasn't good because I remember one of my heroes was Mickey Mantle. He wasn't a cowboy player; he was a baseball player. But he would have that one commercial talking about crying. I want my maple. I didn't know he was teaching me to go in there crying so my mother would feel sorry and go and buy it. But he had, that's what he was doing. We go in there and Mom, I want my maple. And our mother going to buy it because she didn't want us crying. When he had taught us, how to do that. But that's the influence they had, and they were very benign in terms of what they represented. And I really appreciate that. And that's why I was going to the theater to see my hero, one of my heroes, the Lone Ranger, and did not know until I got there, and then 2 hours of that they were getting ready to butcher a hero because of fictional political correctness. Because now, not wanting to offend the Native Americans, they don't mind offending whites. They don't mind offending, those of us who had a Lone Ranger as a hero. No, that's fine. That's par for the course. But to offend any of the minority groups, you got to get out of here with that. We got to practice political correctness with that one, and that's what they were doing for that 2 hours of that film.
Well, they did that with the Wild Wild West several years ago with Will Smith. I like Will Smith. I think he's a good actor. He's not James West.
He's not James. No, he's not. And that role did not work for him because we saw it coming up. I mean, you can't go up here and start changing everything and make it something different than what it was. Now, those of you who think that I'm just dealing with the Cowboys, well, you're looking at a person that's pretty comprehensive in terms of those television programs. I was also disgusted. One person wrote on my wall when I was criticizing the Lone Ranger. One of my former students is living out in Colorado right now. I had her at the university. She said, what do you think about the Superman? Him too. I mean, George Reeves, who played Superman on television, and Christopher Reeves, who's the best Superman in the movie, must be turning over in their grave after the Superman they just had in that was it $120 million or was it $220 million they spent on this later Superman film. That was a disaster also, changing the script. I mean, Clark Kent always worked for the Daily Planet, and they're gonna have him working in as a longshoreman, and then at the end of the film, they're gonna bring him in there where he's getting ready to get a job with Mr. White of the Daily Planet, rather than being there at the beginning and going from Clark Kent to Superman, and from Superman to Clark Kent. That's the way it goes. Now, Hollywood, you got to get these things straight, because you're disappointing us big time out here. And I don't want to go to another movie where you're taking one of our heroes. Well, you can mess with Spider-Man. We didn't like him too much. But but when you start messing with our heroes like the cowboy pictures, and you mess with Superman and have Superman as a longshoreman, and didn't have any character developed where we can see him going back and forth, where you got to have some acting here, because this guy didn't do any acting. He just had all the prosthetics where you're blowing stuff up and people putting their head down, running into each other. No acting. I want to see a switch from Clark Kent to Superman. They never switched because everyone knew he was. Everybody could see that that's Clark Kent, and he came back and that's Superman. It's the same character. And I don't know how they're going to sell that in the sequel if they do a sequel to that film. But it's very disappointing. Okay, that's my Superman and my Long Ranger pitch. I'm not going to be at the whole hour, but I want you to know that if you have not gone to see the movie right now, in the name of all of that which is holy, in the name of the cowboy pictures, don't give those guys, I think I paid $20 for it, and that includes the popcorn, $12.75 for the popcorn, and whatever the difference was, that was a movie theater, so I paid $20 some odd to get in there and eat all the popcorn and get disappointed for 2 hours. But if you're not giving them any money, and I understand it's losing money, it deserves to lose money. We got to send a message to Hollywood that we're not buying you messing with our heroes and making them ambivalent. Because this Long Ranger, as I close out that conversation, this Long Ranger was ambivalent. I didn't know if he's going to shoot somebody in cold blood or not. And the Long Ranger, in the 8 years or so that he was on television, he never killed anybody. He always, shot the ground with your hand and used the silver bullets, which were more straight to the target. And no one ever got killed. I mean, he clubbed you upside, he got some knuckle sandwiches. But everybody was at the end there, and they pull you up by your shirt collar and drug you to jail. But this Long Ranger, we didn't know at the end of the film he was almost going. Was he an outlaw? Is he going to go into outlaw territory, or is he going to continue to be a? We didn't know. And then this really turned me off. Then his brother had a child by this woman, and now his brother's deceased. There's a Long Ranger now on the side talking to her. Let me holler at you on that one. I mean, that's ludicrous. That is not the Long Ranger, and they need not have titled that film The Long Ranger, since it was not about the Long Ranger, but about Tonto, and they could have made it about any of the characters. So my question to Hollywood is this, as I close out on this conversation: why did you name that film The Long Ranger, and what was your political intent? Moss is inquiring about that, because I think there's a political intent in back of it. And I'll tell you what I think that intent is. You've destroyed all of the main heroes in reality. Now you're working on the fictional heroes. That's the only way I can understand what you did with that film. And those are not going to see it.
You ever taken a film class at college level? They have, like you probably did for your for your master's degree. All this stuff like literary analysis for applied to or analysis for film is done through a Marxist lens. The class struggle with dialectical materialism.
Yes.
And they cast their characters as basically, very existentialistic and filled full of angst. And to me, it's like it ruins the plot because of the writers of that and the people who might have modeled those characters on certainly weren't on that mindset or had that worldview available to them at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, yeah, there was some. I mean, a lot of our heroes in history were flawed people. I'll grant you that. Founding fathers, for example, we just celebrated the 4th, but it's absurd to think that they would have agreed with Marxism, like a lot of these idiots, like Bill Maher is trying to say, or they would have. They wouldn't agree with Marxist principles.
No, they wouldn't.
Why hell would they have done that?
And they were no more flawed. They were no more flawed than the others that were practicing the same thing they were practicing, and in many ways were shades above them. This idea that they had their flaws, who in the world at that time were not doing what the framers were in fact doing. That was a universal worldwide practice, and it was no more horrid here than it was elsewhere. And those of you who disagree with me on that need to go read Thomas Sawyer's book called Black Rednecks and White Liberals, page 111. Let's start on that page. That's chapter 4. And just read that one page, really, if you want to read about what he says about that in the third or fourth paragraph of that page, where he says that the horrors of slavery as it's practiced in the Western Hemisphere doesn't even amount to 10% of the horrors that slavery was in fact. That is to say that the horrors of slavery throughout the universality of slavery was 99 times worse than the 10% that it played out over here on this stage in the Western Hemisphere.
Well, like you made several points several times. If you look at the blacks in this country who are slaves, who get a chance to write the narratives, you can see their offspring. If you go to Middle East and see do you see the offspring of the white Europeans brought into slavery into the Middle East? Do you get to hear their narrative? No.
No, you don't.
No.
And John, that is very perceptive on your part to point that out, because unlike in America, where you can go to Douglas's narrative, you can go to the narratives written by other slaves, chronicled in books such as Lay My Burden Down. There were 17 volumes, if not more, of slaves' narratives that were told during the New Deal when they sent the Harlem Renaissance writers out there to take their testimony in the aftermath of their enslavement in the United States during the New Deal during the 1930s, when they gave them something to do after the Harlem Renaissance had run its course. And they got volumes of that in the Library of Congress. Try to find me a slave narrative in the Middle East where slaves were taken there from Africa, and it was much worse and more horrid there, and nobody wants to talk about it, except George Ayete in his book called Africa Unchained. I read the book, and I can tell you right now, the horrible slavery of that time period is much worse, yet you don't have a single person that will talk about it in these African Studies Department courses, because it destroys the narrative.
Well, people don't understand this too, and I don't think most people don't know this, but the word slave comes from the word Slav. The people of Russia and the Czechoslovakia and Croatia are considered Slavic by the Western world, but they don't call themselves that. They call themselves Rus. Russia is a queen of the Russias, which means that, that's the big country for those people. And basically the word slave was given to them by the Vikings who conquered them.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's the very word you're talking about for denote this horrific institution came from there.
It's an Eastern European term. Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia got the word Slav in it. And the Slavic people would be the progenitors of the term slave. And if that was in fact a black characteristic, then why isn't something that was attached to Africa attached to the term? It was a universal practice, and nobody had a monopoly on it, and no one had a monopoly on disengaging from its practice. Really, when you look at the slave experience as far as it relates to blacks, all blacks did who were brought here were transferred from the enslavement in the continent of Africa to the continent in South America and the continent in North America. They changed the location. And anybody that thinks that they did, as Alex Haley had claimed, that the Europeans went into Africa interior and started snatching Africans out and putting them on boats, if you believe that, then you believe in the tooth fairy, because that's not what happened. Whites were not allowed in the interior, and were not able to shoot their way in there. And that's page 27 of the book, written by Bassett Davidson, called, and listen to the title of his book. It was originally called African Mother, but it was changed later on to the African slave trade. And he correctly called it the African slave trade, because this is not the European slave trade. Europe didn't have any control in the interior part of Africa. If they were not allowed in there, and could not have gone into the interior for two reasons. One, didn't have quinine, which was the tsetse fly, would have killed them off. Malaria would have killed them off, and they didn't have the firepower. That was not until the 19th century.
No, that's like another thing is people don't understand too is back in the 70s, I remember a lot of people, blacks, were adopting Islam as their nation. They said that Christianity is a religion of slavery, the slaves. And if you actually go back far enough, the large portions of Africa are already Christianized. The Ethiopian, the Coptic Church, and the Egyptian Coptic Church are very old churches, in my opinion, older than the Roman Catholic Church. I think they actually have more of a claim to that. And if you look at the narrative, if you just look at the Gospels, the Book of Acts talks about,
Yeah.
the connection there already from the time the Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch.
Yeah, you're aware. See, John, you're a reader, so you're aware of the history. What we're doing to the listening audience is probably enlighten some people for the first time of the real narrative of history. What they've done is go to school and learn this fiction. That's called, you get these fictional diplomas and fictional college degrees. But when you go and look at the real record, where you have to study on your own, because classrooms are very narrowly constrained, and they're going to actually teach you this wider view of anything, basically because the universities are making indictments against the country and teaching that we are all these bad things and the rest of the world is fine, and we are the problem. But when you go look at the history, as you said, about just taking Christianity, for example, the Coptic Church in Ethiopia, and then the Catholic Church as it played out in Rome later on. The first time the Catholic Church is set up is in Alexandria, which was a city founded, one of the 12 cities founded by Alexander the Great, because there were 12 cities called Alexandria, most of them in Asia, which we've not heard of, but there was one in Egypt called Alexandria that was set up in the aftermath and to commemorate the life and death of Alexander the Great. I named one of the cities there that had been that was named Alexandria after Alexander died in 323 or 322 before the Common Era. But Hollywood needs to get its act together is the main point being made here. And they don't have the act together. And we know that behind the lens there is an ideological perspective, as can be seen, John, by the fact that we've had two different films made on Atlas Shrugged, and they have lost their shirt in each of those cases. It takes $10 million to make that film, part one, and $10 million to make part two. And the guy's lost his shirt, but he's committed to trying to wrestle from the clutches of Hollywood and a story that actually celebrates what this country has stood for. And I said all kinds of problems because they're blocking his access. They didn't block Michael Moore, but this guy that's trying to tell the other story, he's being blocked in every way. As they blocked C.L. Bryan, who made the film called Runaway Slaves. So I know the mindset that's in back of it, but and that's why I don't take what they did with The Lone Ranger as being something that was accidental. I think behind the lens, what they were doing here was taking another part of what they have not yet turned upside down in his head. And those of us in the elder group that have these images of America back in the time period when we were much more innocent as a nation, what they're doing now is going back over that landscape and doing assaults upon that. I can't understand it without going into the political arena and understanding through the political lens. And I think that's what was going on here. But anyway, it was a travesty, and if you've not spent your money on it, then you don't say that I didn't warn you if you go to see it. But it's not worth the time, and the writers on it have been bad. I hope they'll lose their shirt. Let me talk about something else here real quickly that I came to the studio to talk about, and I want to talk about the Trayvon Martin case, because I have watched every minute of the case. I've been up to two. I'll be glad when this case is over for one reason that's personal, and that is that it has really made me stay up to 2 o'clock in the morning to watch it, because I tape it first so I can bypass all the breaks they have, because although it starts at 9 o'clock with about an hour break for lunch, and then they have these sidebars where the jury is in and out, and that it basically has ended about 5 o'clock in the afternoon with all the breaks. That's 8 hours if you just go from 9 to 5, and then they have these commercial breaks that make it go on even longer than that, where it doesn't end to around 7 when I have to suffer listen to Jane Velez Mitchell. And there's the other person where after I listen to Nancy Grace, I'll tell you, I can barely breathe listening to what they're talking about. I just watched the trial and then listen to what they have to say about it. It's like night and day. The only one on HLN is where it's being aired, and the only one that's actually been halfway fair is this brilliant lawyer. I mean, an absolutely brilliant attorney named Joey Jackson. And someone told me that he was once on Fox as a commentator. I mean, I guess on Greta's show. I don't know if that's true or not, but I tell you this: he is absolutely brilliant and fairly, not even by the standards of HLN. He's a very fair-minded person that looks at both sides of what is going on. But if you listen to Nancy Grace, let me tell you what happened Friday. and how it was treated on HLN on Nancy Grace's show, because Joey Jackson substituted for Jane Velez Mitchell, who has now gone down to Sanford. Now, she was not down there, which I think this is very interesting also. She was not down there the whole time the prosecution was putting on his case for whatever that was, because we're not even aware, even after they did their arresting Friday afternoon, we're not even sure at this point what their case was. And that's why the defense attorney, the leading defense attorney, got up in the courtroom Friday after the prosecutors rested their case and asked the judge, Deborah Nelson, to give a summary verdict of dismissal, to acquit it without going before the jury and without the defense having made their claims, because the case that they presented so far is such that you need to go into the defense. But here's what I thought was really interesting Friday. And this was real, you have to be very careful in watching it, because a lot of assaults were going on. They had to be very careful in how, and this is both sides, how they approached Trayvon Martin's mother for different reasons, Sabrina Fulton. On the one hand, the prosecutors had to be very careful, because if they open up an area for the defense to go into to bring Trayvon's character into the trial, that could be a problem for the prosecution. At the same time, to not bring up Trayvon Martin's name would raise a question among the jurors about why would the prosecution, having the mother on the stand, not bring that up. So the prosecution had this task ahead of them, to mention the name without going into anything that would open a pathway up to the defense, while making it appear that they were doing something substantive with Trayvon Martin. That's how they did it. They asked the mother, Sabrina Fulton, they said, Miss Fulton, did Trayvon Martin have any marks on his body? Yes, he did. And what were those marks? And the answer was he had tattoos. So now is, tattoos. I mean, is this like, all up and down your arms and your neck, like the bird? I mean, what is that? And she said tattoos, and he asked, and what was on those tattoos? And the answer was, I love you, Mom. And so when that was said, the prosecution dropped all of its questions about Trayvon Martin. The next witness came up, and that was Trayvon Martin's brother, who is going to college. His name is Javaris Fulton. Interesting enough, Sabrina Fulton, Javaris Fulton, and is staying with Sabrina Fulton's brother, who is, I think, Robert Fulton. They all got the name Fulton. Trayvon Martin has Martin, and his dad's name is Tracy Martin. Of course, the defense can't get into that, because you get into that like you're beating down on a woman, and she's all lost her son, and Javaris lost the brother. So the defense got to be very careful in interrogating what would have been a really interesting, some interesting information that could have come out about the way they're trying to paint this family as being stable and things like that. And out of that came Trayvon, who looked at his brother. And what the prosecution was doing was getting the jury to transfer onto Trayvon qualities found in Javaris, his brother. Asked me, what school is he going to? How long has he been in college? What will you be in the fall? He'll be a senior. He's 22 years old. It was a remarkable story about the brother. And then, because he didn't ask any other question about Trayvon other than the tattoo, then you then extrapolate, the brother was going to college. And so you assume then, without being told this, that if Trayvon were alive, you just have an assumption that, he potentially would be in college also. Is that these persons on the same path? Well, Friday they brought the mother on the stand, and she testified, as to be expected, that the voice on the tape screaming for help was her son. Now, Nancy Grace spent all of her program I clocked it, 56 minutes of a program was spent on talking about the powerful testimony of Trayvon's mother, the emotional testimony where she said that was her son on the tape. You would never have known unless you watched it yourself that George Zimmerman's mother also testified on the stand. In fact, her name is Gladys Zimmerman. You would never have known that Gladys Zimmerman testified on the stand, also was the first witness called by the defense. And the second witness, of which the trial ended after the second witness was called until it was deferred until today, the second witness was Trayvon Martin's uncle, who works for the state of Florida in the capacity of being in the courtroom. And if they thought that Trayvon Martin's mother's testimony was powerful, and that the family members had testified in a very powerful way, although there was equivocation in terms of Javaris's testimony, because he had to admit that when he first heard the screaming on that tape, he expressed doubts to one of the reporters that was his brother's voice on the tape. Later on, he would change his mind and become more definitive about it, but at the very beginning, he has acknowledged that there was some question about whether or not that was his brother's voice. But George Zimmerman's mother had no equivocation. And when they asked her, the defense asked her, how do you know that's your son on the tape? And this woman said, he's my son. He's my son. The uncle, I thought, was even more powerful. When they put him on the stand, he talked about how he took his oath to tell the truth as an officer of the state in the year 2000. He said that once this case broke, that his nephew was involved in this tragedy, he divorced himself from all things having to do with this case. That he did not want to have anything to do with it. He didn't discuss it with anybody in the family. He wanted to be able to get on the witness stand and tell the truth. His testimony was that when the case started and they were doing the investigation, he made it a point not to get involved in it in any way. He said that when he was at his computer one day in his household, he was had his back to the television set, and he was doing something. He said, I can't remember what I was doing, but I know it was on the computer. He said, and then a screen came across on the TV set, and he said to his wife, that's George. He said, what are you listening to? And he turned around, and there was on the screen where it said George Zimmerman, the tape of the tragedy involving George Zimmerman, and he said that that was when he heard the screen, his first reaction to his wife was, what are you listening to? That was George. He said because he had been with his nephew, from the time his nephew was born, and he could tell that was his nephew's voice. And he said that he not only heard the scream in his ear, he said he heard it in the spirit, that he knew that was his nephew. And if they thought the testimony earlier was powerful, and it was powerful because the parents are testifying and the brothers testifying, that evidence put in before the jury in the courtroom with the Trayvon Martin parents and parent and his brother was not any more powerful, probably was less powerful than that of George Zimmerman's family, which had a tremendous amount of dignity. When the trial is over and they're going into deliberating in the jury room, I'm going to come before you on FlintTalkRadio.com and give you my own take on the tape, which I already have drawn some conclusions about it, but I want to wait because we haven't heard everything yet in the trial, and I want to wait before I make any definitive comments about this trial until we have all the evidence in. But I've drawn some conclusions about it already, and I think you'll find that very interesting based upon the evidence that's been presented in this case. But I'll hold off until the rest of the case plays out, because I think that it's going to be wrapped up. My prediction is that it's going to be wrapped up between Wednesday and Thursday. I don't think it's going to go. I'd be very surprised if this court case goes to Friday, because I think it's going to be given into the hands of the jury by Thursday afternoon. So they'll have Friday to deliberate, and maybe they will deliberate even Saturday, and then Monday can come back in the courtroom with a verdict. I think they want to go home, and I think that the defense is going to service its case very well if they, in fact, will make their case, the rest of their case, I should say, and then let the jury go into the deliberation room and judge the case based upon the evidence on the record. Because a lot of it, quite frankly, was put on the record by the prosecution's team. And I think all the pundits who are not biased will admit that a lot of those witnesses for the prosecution were turned to the advantage of the defense. And I'll talk about that as well when the jury goes into deliberations. And we come back to the studio to talk about it, because I don't think that is going to be... We'll have a lot to say about it, but we'll wait until the time is right. To all things, there's a season. So wait until the time is right in order to do that. And the time is not yet right for us to do it now and preempt the jury going into deliberations, although the jury is sequestered and wouldn't be able to hear what's being said on any of the airways anyway. But I want to hold off out of respect for our listeners who are looking at the evidence and have yet to make up their mind based upon the evidence. So let's have all the evidence in, and we'll come to talk about it at some point, together. And that's what we will, in fact, end up doing. So that's down the road a piece. The last thing I want to talk about today has to do with the ruling that I was discussing on radio, which has to do with the ruling by the Supreme Court to strike down Section 4 of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. That could be a whole program on that. I did an hour program on one of the programs last Thursday. And it really deserves a lot more time than we have to give it today in the studio, but I did want to make a couple of preliminary points, and which I don't think anybody else has made. And that is, I think first and foremost, is that the Civil Rights Act of 1965 is nothing other than repetition of the 15th Amendment, which was passed in 1870, where you have the Constitution saying that you cannot deny the right to vote based upon race, color, nationality, the previous condition of servitude. And the 1957 Civil Rights Act was passed, which is basically a repeat of the 15th Amendment, which forbids anyone from being denied the right based upon those preconditions. And so all they're doing, quite frankly, is passing bills that further the ends of the 15th Amendment, which is already in the Constitution. The Constitution is the law of the land. So what are we doing here with passing the bill in 1965, which is just repetitive of what the Constitution requires? You can't keep people from voting because of their race or their nationality or previous condition of servitude, which would mean slavery, and not that anybody would have been a slave at the time when it's passed, because slavery entered in 1865 with the 13th Amendment. But if your ancestry was in fact slavery, then it forbids that. So that would be something we need to discuss. And what I would say about it is that when it was passed in 1965, and the reason why we remember that more than we do in 1957 is because the ones that were doing the discrimination against blacks in the South were the Democrats. And until the Democrats buy into its practice ought to be stopped, it can't be stopped. Eisenhower, that was the president in 1957 when you passed that particular bill, was a Republican. And so the Republicans are not the ones in the South discriminating. It cannot be stopped by the Republicans that are in fact passing it. Because the South is in fact owned, bought, and paid for by the Democratic Party. And it takes that party to buy into in order for it to be ended. And that's why we remember 65 and don't remember the other. Now, the civil rights leadership wants to claim that unless we have this on the books, I want you to think about this. Unless we have this restriction on the book, Section 4, which gives oversight responsibility to the federal government to look at any change they have in the passing of the civil rights bills, any change in voting in the South must come through the DOJ, which means get approval from Eric Holder. And because we need to still have this oversight, which would be, 48 years later after the bill had been passed in 1965. So the idea is that we need to still hold the South down so that it would not be able to, in fact, suppress the rights of those blacks that are voting. Well, let's look at that for a minute, because that is an interesting claim being made by blacks like John Lewis and others who are in the Democratic Party who don't want to recognize it was their party that had to be stopped. They don't want that to get out to black America. So they want to act like, well, the South is still, how could it be still that and you're in the party that was in fact doing it? But that's not what the South is today. I looked it up last week. I didn't get around to it, but I was going to tell you last week in the discussion, that every governor in this one solid South that was in the Confederacy, with the single exception of Arkansas, has a Republican governor. Now, granted, some of the border states, like Maryland and Missouri, which never left the Union, that were slave states, have Democratic governors. But every one of the 11 Confederate governors, every one of the 11 Confederate states, with the exception of Arkansas, have a Republican governor, which means that Ann Coulter is writing her book called Demonic, when she says that the reason why the lynching stopped in the South is because the party that was doing the lynching was in fact thrown out of office. I mean, Wallace is gone because, number one, he's not around anymore. He's now deceased. Not that I'm talking about him in that sense, but I'm saying that the party that has a stranglehold on stopping blacks from voting, that party is out of power in the South right now. 10 of the 11 governors in Confederate states are now in the Republican Party. And South Carolina, remember that state? The first one to leave the Union? South Carolina was the first state to threaten secession in 1824 and 1828, threatened it with the tariff of abomination, and actually left the Union, leading the South out of that December the 20th, 1860, where they were joined by 6 other states eventually in February of 1861. They were the first ones to leave. Well, South Carolina today has the only black senator in the Congress representing South Carolina. And are you telling me that in a state, South Carolina, that left the Union first and foremost to form the first secessionist state to leave the Union, and then was the backbone of building the Confederacy? The only thing different was that the Confederacy was not founded. The Confederacy was not founded in Charleston, South Carolina. It was founded in Montgomery, but really it should have been founded in South Carolina, since they were the first ones to succeed. They have now Tim Scott, a black senator in the Senate. The only black person in the Senate is from the South. There are no other black senators, and with the exception of Obama and Mosley, Carol Mosley Bromley, and Burgess, who was appointed when Obama was kicked upstairs to the presidency, and Edward Brooks in Massachusetts. In other words, with the exception of Illinois and Massachusetts, there have been no states to elected blacks to serve in the Senate. But yet in the southern states, you have several of them that have done so. So we don't need that. And what they're really afraid of is not that discrimination is going to kick back in. What they're afraid of, in taking these laws down, nothing is going to happen, which then raises the question of what is all this racism rhetoric about, which is going to end their hullabaloo. And that's what they're afraid of, because nothing's going to happen in terms of stopping blacks from voting in the South. Okay, we got to get out of here. I'm glad to be able to talk about 3 different topics today that became the studio to talk about, and we got through all of them, and that's a plus. And I'll see all of you next week when we get ready for another edition as we talk further about the Trayvon Martin case. Until that time, we want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you will never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.